And then, of course, everybody is kind of involved in this large-scale hysteria about Ukraine right now.
That's true. This can become a big problem. I think this is also the end of Pax America. America is no longer in a position to educate problems between countries, and this is going to lead to humongous problems in the future.
Yeah, it's sort of, I guess, a domino effect, because everyone will sort of figure out suddenly, oh, the U.S. isn't going to take care of this.
Right. Anything is possible right now because the wokes are in charge of the West. They are not competent. They just, they are after diversity rather than meritocracy. And this is going to continue the degeneration of the West, which is what we see reflected in this Ukraine-Russia problem.
Yeah. So you think this is kind of the beginning, and we're just going to see probably gradually crisis after crisis as people figure out there's no safe box here to climb into.
Right. Yeah. The problem, the current issue is not the biggest problem. The biggest problem, in my view, is that this is the beginning of the end of Pax Americana. And the world has been relatively peaceful because the world has been fearful of the U.S. Now, if this fear goes away, the tyrants, the dictators will emerge out of the woodworks very quickly, and they will assert themselves. I mean, people are free to the degree that America is there, to the degree that they are scared of the U.S., not because of the democracies in those countries in Africa or Latin America. Those tyrants don't care about their democratic system. They care about the U.S.
So in a way, you've got a situation where Putin is one of the smarter operators. He already knows this, and he's in a position where he wants to do something, and he's a lot more confident than other people about his ability to do so, because he kind of sees, he probably knows about Biden. Biden's been around for a long time. He sort of sees the U.S. is in disarray, and this is his chance.
And Z I'm sure figures that out as well, which is, I love China, as you know, but I don't want China to be in charge of the world. But Biden, because of his incompetence, is basically going to hand over control of the world to China.
Yeah, and you see, like, on these WEF organizations and all this, they have Xi up as like the first speaker. Everyone's very excited, and he's like the man of the day. They're not as excited about Biden and these folks anymore.
WEF and the current Western rulers are so naive and childish in how they think and what they think. Look at Kamala Harris. I mean, she goes to a meeting in Europe and starts calling those people, "Hey guys."
Very casual.
Very casual. Yeah.
Well, let's come back to that. I guess we'll go to our questions now, and then we'll, Ukraine either come up in the process, or we can sort of tack it on to the other questions. So. First, since a couple of folks have joined and they may not know who you are, do you want to sort of tell us from I guess, kind of a professional perspective, but also your work on the Capitalism and Culture Conference, a little bit about yourself?
I immigrated to Canada about 17 years back, and since then I have mostly been working in the junior mining sector, analyzing junior mining companies. But one of my passions is to travel around the world, and I travel around the world all the time. I like to understand different cultures, economies of different societies, and I want to write and speak about those societies. So that work consumes a lot of my time, probably more time than what I spend on analyzing junior mining companies. I grew up in India, so that's where I lived most of my life before I moved to Canada.
And so do you want to talk a little bit about sort of roughly, when you came and your path here? I think you're in Canada now, but did you end up straight in Canada, or did you go through some other experiences to get here? And I guess I'm kind of curious, you had a certain worldview, I assume, when you were in India, and depending on your age and what happened to you when you first arrived in the West, do you remember your impressions and what things really stood out to you, or did you have some particular experiences that sort of set the frame for you?
Yeah, so actually Canada wasn't the first country I went to. The first time I went to the West was to study in the UK. I was about 24, 25 years old, and this was a visit which changed me over that 1.5 years. It was an eye-opening experience for me. I had often thought about why India was such a wretched, poor place, and what was it about the Western people that made them so wealthy and uh, so open-minded and so progressive. And it was uh, those 1.5 years which changed my understanding about why the West was so good. Now, there's a saying which says that grass is always greener on the other side. But once I was in the UK, I realized that that grass was much greener than I thought it was going to be. Now, Messenger, I had no money those days. I was broke. I was mostly eating boiled rice with tomato ketchup and boiled potatoes. And usually those were rotten potatoes because those were the cheapest food I can buy, but those were some of the happiest days I have had.
Wow. So you really arrived with nothing, but then you had an even better experience than you thought you would based on your initial impressions as an outsider.
Absolutely. I mean, it started from the first day, the day I arrived at Heathrow. I had never known a train ticket seller talking with me so decently and so respectfully. When you go to buy tickets in India, the ticket seller wants to show himself as if he is something, he has huge power in his hands, and they exploit you, they degrade, they demean you all the time, government people. But my first experience, the first encounter was extremely good. And what I found very interesting was that people were lining up. People were in a queue. I had no concept of queue until that time, and no one was pushing me around to stop me from communicating with the ticket seller. Things which are completely alien in India even today. So this was just an eye-opening experience. I paid for my post-graduation, but the education I got from the society was 1,000 times more valuable than the learning that I had in the classrooms. So that's how enlightening those 1.5 years were for me. But not just the what I saw with my eyes. What I experienced was the interaction with the local people, the compassion, tolerance, understanding that they showed towards me. Remember, Messenger, when I first arrived in the UK, I did not know what that plastic card that my bank sent me was all about. I had
Oh,
no,
really?
yeah, absolutely. I had no clue what McDonald's was. I had no clue what Pepsi and Coke were. And people, and you know, people in India, if you didn't know what was supposed to be known, would simply laugh at you. But I can't remember ever if people demeaned me for not knowing what I didn't know. I mean, I was sitting in my MBA class when people were discussing about Pepsi and Coke, when I did not even know what those things were. So it was not just about learning about what Pepsi and Coke stood for, but understanding about the human interaction, the social aspect of it, uh, how accepting and tolerant people were around me. Now, of course, not you know, some people were, I'm sure, making fun of me in my back, in my back, but I'm not sure about it. But the society was, in general, extremely tolerant, and I learned those qualities from them as much as I could.
That's great. And so basically, were you, so you're in the UK, I mean, the UK has some level of minorities, I guess, if you call them, but it's BAME or something over there. were you sort of in the minority, or were you in an area that there were other people from India? I mean, if you didn't feel any sort of judgment or whatever, or at least you didn't hear any to your face, that's very interesting.
Well, when I arrived in the UK, I started living with other Indians, and we were cooking Indian food, and I was in what was the poorest and most crime-prone place in Manchester.
Wow.
That was the best I could afford. And then over the next few days, I started to think, why had I decided to live with Indians? Now, nothing wrong with Indians as such, but I had left India to learn about the UK, not to implant myself into a little India in the UK. So within a couple of months, actually, I was trying to get out of that arrangement. And I did leave that house. Those were perfectly fine people who I lived with, but I wanted to experience the UK. I did not want to live within a little India within the UK. And I still lived in a very poor part of Manchester. But still, there were Indians around me. There were minorities and Indians around me. The UK, the ghettos are mostly non-English people. So there wasn't going to be racism against me as such within the area that I was living in those days.
Right. And now, since then, I mean, for your work, after you got out of school and everything, you've kind of traveled around a lot. I mean, I guess a question would be is, you're kind of a student of human nature, and maybe you can talk a little bit about the places that you travel in the last few years, or in general. And I'd be kind of curious as to whether you sort of divide the world up kind of culturally based on your experiences, because you've mentioned India and the West, but I know you also spend time in, what we think of as the East as well, or East Asia. And so, for a lot of people, there's always this kind of common way that they look at these places, and they have stereotypes about how you sort of group people. Is there sort of a moral difference or difference in social order? You've touched on it a little bit, but I'm just kind of curious about whether you sort of have a schema or, experiences traveling have led you in that direction.
Yes, I started traveling pretty much immediately after completion of my education in the UK. I managed to become country manager of a British company. They wanted to start an Indian office. And I got that job, and that was another great experience for me, because they trusted me with a lot of money and starting with an operation in India, and I was able to travel the world because of them. Whenever I went to the UK, I would take a transit flight through another country and break my flight on the way back from the UK. So I saw a lot of the world that way, and I started taking vacations outside India. And since for the last 17 years, I have been working in the mining industry. I worked for a boutique house in the US, a company that was very generous in terms of helping me understand the world. They used to send me around the world to look at mine sites. So that added to my understanding of the world. Now, what I have come to a conclusion at is that the world is basically divided into two parts. One is the Western countries, and the countries that have managed to copy the Western society. The West is, of course, European countries, North America, Australia, and New Zealand. And there are countries that have managed successfully to copy the Western society. And those societies are East Asian countries, starting with Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, South Korea, and increasingly China. So these are the countries which, in my model, sits in one block. They are, I call them the West, or the countries that have successfully copied the West. And then you have the rest, and the rest is the third world countries, who were the third world countries, who are the third world countries, and who will increasingly become fourth world countries as Pax Americana fails, and as the control of Europeans over these third worlders continues to fail, which has actually been happening for the last 70 years. These people in the third world countries don't understand the white man's burden, if I can use that term. Without European control, without English control, without American control over the third world institutions will just continue to fall apart, and they will become completely feral as time goes by. And remember, about 4 to 5 billion of the world's population lives in that third world.
Yeah, and you used the term feral. That's interesting. It's sort of like basically when humans revert to just this survival instinct of an animal. They don't plan ahead. They sort of tear at each other, and things just kind of go to chaos. And so your sense is that somehow an orderly society evolved out of a certain part of Western societies, that the East, especially in, I guess, in economic areas, I don't know, maybe law and whatever, they have kind of adopted this order. And that as far as you can tell, there's a lot of third world countries that just haven't picked up on these things at all. So that if I understand you, I mean, they're kind of reliant upon the West. They probably get a lot of donations and those sort of things. If that sense of order and that support disappears, then for you, they would really descend into a lot more chaos.
Well, they are already very chaotic. And there is no moral structure in most of those societies. The institutions are there, and whatever sanity is there is mostly because what the British left behind. The British created kinds of institutions that had a very long life, and that is why it has taken 70, 80 years for them to completely fall apart. But when I use the word feral, I'm not using it loosely. There is a virtual complete absence of moral consciousness in the third world. They are driven by their base animalistic instincts. There is hardly any thought about the past or the future. So they don't really care about their history, and they don't really care about ideas, and they don't really care about planning for the future. And to varying degrees, you see the same pattern across the third world. You can go to pretty much anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa, or you can go to South Asia, or you can go to a lot of Latin American countries, and you see the same pattern, except that to the extent Europeans are part of those societies might have some sanity and some institutional structures.
And being from India and saying more or less that any structure they have now is probably due more to British influence. I mean, does that upset a lot of folks from India? Because I've heard them say things like, well, we have this caste reservation system, we're going to equalize everything, and we were socialist until the 90s, and so now everything's going to be okay, we just need another 10 years, or things like that.
Well, their excuses will change all the time. But India is not going to improve. India will continue to get worse. Now, do people get offended? They did not get offended until, I would say, early 1990s. They started to get offended once the woke people of the West started telling Indians that you have to get offended and then the people of the third world started to realize that they could whine and complain and ask for reparations and free stuff from the West. And that was their way also to think that they had a higher moral ground. But strangely, before the advent of the internet and before the advent of this masses of woke people emerging in the West, I don't think people in the third world necessarily thought badly about people from Europe. In fact, if you read Indian history, you realize that a lot of most lower caste people, Muslims, were very happy to have the British continue to rule the country. A lot of Indians actually left India with the British. There was an exodus from India in 1947 because those people clearly knew what was going to come next. It was exactly the same in Rhodesia when Mugabe came into power. Now, Mugabe became a saint eventually, and then, of course, a tyrant, but the local people knew what he was, and there was a massive exodus of Rhodesians, which is now Zimbabwe, It started immediately with the British leaving Zimbabwe. It's not that people, the natural elite of those societies didn't know what was coming. They knew what was coming. But this woke culture, this political correctness has erased that wisdom from us. We now feel confused why these third world countries are disintegrating. But people of 1940s knew very well why these countries would disintegrate. Read Sir Winston Churchill, and he will tell you about what he thought about India. He called them beastly people. Now, of course, he said those kind of words mostly in passion, probably not thought through, and not what he said for public, but these are recorded words of his. But they are not inaccurate at all. They have proven the test of time.
So then that's an interesting way to look at it, is that there's sort of a clear delineation, if you will. A lot of people, of course, didn't know much about India until people begin to migrate here for work, or we started offshoring work there. So I think they think it's perfectly natural that, well, maybe India has always been the way it is now, and they presume that it's this kind of spiritual place, and it's economically going to compete with China any day soon. But now that you're saying, well, no, a lot of people left, and really this sense of trying to say that things are going to be great and being negative about the West kind of came along with the internet, and that it's an aspect of woke culture, I think is probably an eye-opener for a lot of people.
Well, firstly, anyone who tries to compare India and China has no clue about either of the two countries. I go to China quite often, and when I go to China from India, China feels like a first world country. China is about 6 times richer on per capita basis, and the distance between Indian GDP per capita and Chinese GDP per capita is increasing by the day. Chinese growth rate continues to be higher. So it is, I would say, virtually stupid to compare China and India. China will continue to progress, and India has started to stagnate for the last 2-3 years. And my view is that India has no hope for growing anymore, because it has reached this glass ceiling above which it is no longer able to go. In fact, India is on its way to falling apart and falling into a complete chaos as time goes by. Now, the funny thing is why people call India a spiritual place, because India is not a spiritual place, Messenger. It's the most amoral country among the most amoral societies I could think of. Indians don't have a sense of moral values. Now, I'm not saying they are immoral. They're just amoral. They don't care about moral values. So there's no spirituality in India. What actually happened was that if you look at the last 70 years of third world history, the West have desperately tried to identify saints in the third world. Look at Nelson Mandela, Mugabe, Gandhi. Mostly nothing, either they were useless people or they were made saints just because they had, they were slightly better than the rest of the population.
So there, to some extent, there's this sort of history that we hear about. And what you're saying is if you're really over there and you know what's going on, some of this is just propaganda almost.
All of it is propaganda.
Okay.
People knew that these countries would fall apart with the departure of the British. Read Rabindranath Tagore, for example, a Nobel Prize winning Nobel laureate of India from early 20th century. He wanted Indians to work with the British. Raja Ram Mohan Roy, the guy who is supposed to have started Indian Renaissance, he wanted to get rid of the Hindu superstitions in which Hindus were burning widows on the pyre of their dead husbands. Now, a society suffering from that kind of backwardness had no interest in getting rid of the British. The only people who had an interest in getting rid of the British were the people who went to study in the UK, ironically, who went to the UK, and all they saw in the UK was socialism, because their operating system, the culture that grew up in, did not allow them to see the concept of honor, the concept of integrity, the concept of liberty that existed in the UK. When they went to the UK, all they saw was socialism. And that's what they tried to import to India. And from the leftists in the UK, they tried to import the so-called independence movement. And none of those things they could implement properly. They did not want independence of India. They actually just wanted to be tyrants of those countries. And you can see that pattern across the third world. Virtually every third world country, I think the only exception is Singapore, became a tyrannical society immediately after the British left. So people weren't looking for liberty. I mean, do you think a person living off $100 GDP per capita in 1940s was thinking of liberty? No, he was thinking about filling up his stomach. And that's what most of these people still think about. They have no concept of liberty.
And I mean, I knew about the fact that the British, after World War II, the empire started collapsing. And at that point, they had all these internal problems. And so you had the rise of the Labour Party and all that. But I never really thought about or knew about that as kind of a British export to India. That's very interesting. I mean, I guess this thing you mentioned about India and China is kind of fascinating, because from a Western perspective, you know, I used to read The Economist magazine, I mean, for probably 30 years. And every year for the 30 years, they pronounced that China is going to collapse. The banking system is going to collapse. The people are going to rise up. I mean, it was just endless. And that same time, every year they would say, you know, India is a democracy. That's its main feature. Therefore, it's going to overtake China. And it's only in recent years that they stopped saying that. And of course, they never said, well, we were wrong, or why were we wrong? It was always, India is a democracy. China is a dictatorship of communism. Therefore, it has to be the case that India is going to succeed and China is going to fail. And of course, there was the other part of it was, let's just go ahead and give China all these nice terms, trade and all this stuff, because, you know, as soon as they have a good life, they're going to then also become democrats. Then you'll have this great new world of the prosperous democratic India and the prosperous democratic China. And it just hasn't worked out that way, I guess.
Well, democracy does not improve a society. I have never seen a country becoming democratic and improving thereafter. Democracy is dictatorship of the masses. And all you have to do is to spend some time with the masses to understand what kind of degradation their vote will lead to. And you have to understand the masses of India and it doesn't take much time, Messenger. You just have to spend a few minutes with the average guy in India to understand what his thinking is and what kind of voting he will do and what kind of so-called leaders he will elect. This has to lead to a vicious cycle, which has to lead to a continual degradation of the institutions, because the masses in any society actually, but particularly in India, the 51% people who decide on who becomes the rulers of that society are completely illiterate, uneducated, tribal, narrow-minded, superstitious, decadent, depraved people with no honor, no integrity, none of the value system that you think is natural to human beings. Those values simply don't exist in the third world. They don't exist in India. They don't exist. They certainly don't exist among the poor people, the vast majority of Indians, and I would say hardly a very small percentage of Indians understand the concept of honor and integrity.
Have you heard these internet terms, red pill and black pill, these kind of things?
Well, blue pill and red pill. I don't know what black pill is.
Yeah. Oh yeah, blue pill and red pill. Red pill is kind of the thing that people want to use a lot. But then there came to be a point where it's like, actually, I'm going to tell you this truth, but instead of it enlightening you, it's going to make you realize the hopelessness in a few cases of something that you just can't fix, and that's called as a black pill. So I think you have some red pills, but a couple of these are also what I would call black pills. So I thought I better introduce you to that term, so if you have another audience, you can know what kind of prescription you're giving them.
Well, firstly, you're partly right. I don't think there is an easy solution to the problems of the third world. In fact, there are. When I go to the third world now, I engage with the third world as if I were watching a documentary, because I know I can't really make a change in their lives. Having said that, I think the best that can happen is for Europeans of 1940s to return back to rule the third world countries. Now, there's nothing bad about it. The head of the Bank of the United Kingdom until recently was a Canadian. United Arab Emirates and Singapore and Hong Kong very openly invite the best talents from around the world to run their societies. So there's nothing wrong in bringing in the best people to manage and administer and run your societies. And I think the third world people should actually voluntarily invite Europeans or whosoever are the best brains to come and rule their societies. And that should lead to a significant improvement. But there's a limit to how much they can improve if you think they will ever become as open-minded or honorable or as economically well off as the Western societies are. You are dreaming. It's not going to happen.
It's interesting. And so kind of now that I sort of understand your view of, how the world is divided up and what's possible and how some of the views people have, a big question for people in the U.S. and I guess in the West generally is when you bring in lots of immigrants, and the U.S. has really ramped up its immigration recently. I know you were in Mexico recently, for instance, and you said that you had been to places like in East Asia and Africa and Europe. So if you think of the larger groups that come here kind of en masse in recent years, what becomes, I guess we can guess at what their goals are, but then what happens with respect to what they end up doing, and then how the people locally, since they're not that familiar with these people, how they kind of respond, and then what sort of either, mess that you get out of this, sort of different views and trying to integrate them somehow.
Well, my only suggestion is to close the doors. You cannot have so many people coming into your country and not fundamentally changing your country. Now, I can fully understand that you might have 0.1 or 0.05% of your population as people from people who have recently immigrated. But look at Canada, Australia. Close to 40 to 50% of their population is made up of first or second generation immigrants. Now, the trend is pretty much the same in the rest of the Western countries. They are going to lose their European flavor over the next few decades. They are no longer going to be European majority countries. Now, let's look at something very practical. It's an empirical information. There's nothing good or bad about it. It's just a fact. Look at the 200 countries on the planet and identify those countries where have either European majority or East Asian majority, and you will suddenly figure out that virtually all of them are either developed countries or on the path to becoming developed countries. Excuse me. Any of the countries where Europeans or East Asians are not in majorities are third world countries and are getting worse with time. So do you want to import people who reduce your majority and then convert you into third world countries? Now, the problem is that today, most of the people who come to the US and Canada don't come here to seek liberty because they are passionate about Western values or because they are passionate about Christianity. They come here for an easy life, and life does become quite easy. You know, the kind of salaries you get here, the kind of material comforts you get in the West are just so much better than what you get in the third world. So a lot of those people come here, and I can understand why they want to come here, but do you want them here because they are not oriented towards liberty, they are not oriented towards Western values, and their voting structure, their contribution to the culture of the society is going to be negative, not positive. And that's what you see as reflected in increasingly in your politics. Your rulers are increasingly people like Justin Trudeau, Biden, and Kamala Harris.
It's interesting. I mean, I guess you've answered to some extent by saying you got to close your doors, but I noticed once you tweeted that maybe people who come here shouldn't vote for a few generations because it seems to take that long for them to be integrated. I mean, if you were like a trillionaire and, you know, more popular than Bill Gates, and these Western countries came to you and said, hey, we've realized we really screwed this up badly and we need some help to get our way out of it. I mean, would it just be the only possibility now was to halt immigration for a while until these people are absorbed, or there's some other steps that you would advise them to take, given that they're kind of already on this path of unintegrated groups of people who just don't care about their culture?
Well, the first question is, do people ever get absorbed? Look at the gypsies, the Romas of Europe. They have been in Europe for the last more than a millennia. They haven't got integrated in the society. Even the Europeans who had Christianity as their religion took hundreds of years to get integrated in the American and Canadian society. Integration takes a very, very long time. I completely agree that one thing that we can easily do is to make sure that immigrants don't get to vote for maybe 3 generations, maybe 4 generations, and with the voters reserving the right to change that rule as they experience how involved these immigrants and their second and third generation progeny become in the Western society. But also, you know, you can bring them in, and you can bring them in the way Dubai, Hong Kong, and Singapore brings people in, which basically says that, hey, you are never going to become citizens of this country. You are here to work. When the work is over, you have to leave within a month. And if you have to accept refugees, make sure refuge does not become a path to citizenship. Now, you do want to help out people, but it should not become a path to citizenship. Also, because you should remember that the people who manage to find refuge in a better country are the more intelligent, are the better off people of those backward societies. So you denude those backward societies of leadership if you allow their best people to come in. So when people say that we should only restrict immigration to the very best, that itself is a problem, because if you let in the best people, their best people, you decapitate the best people from their leadership positions.
Right. So I guess that we have problems now where the woke stuff and whatever has kind of just gutted our educational system in a sense of, like, history, let's say specifically. You come in and instead of learning the real history, you learn all this other stuff, you know. But I guess what you're saying is that even if we were to do things like fix the educational system, that really the way that people become members of the society is when they come in small enough numbers and they're here for a few generations, they just absorb the culture, and that's probably the most successful way. And if there's just too many of them, or if you let them start to have power immediately, there may be even good history education, all that means nothing to them.
Well, education does nothing to you, wealth does nothing to you, unless you have the foundations of European values. You have to have the concept of honor, the concept of truthfulness within you. Now, Messenger, let me tell you this thing. When I first arrived in the UK, and this was one of my moments of awakening in the UK, it took me a few months to realize that people were speaking the truth, mostly the truth. And I used to wonder, why do these people speak the truth? Because I was taught that I should speak what sounds good, not what is the truth. Now, of course, the English sugarcoat a lot. They are too polite sometimes when they don't actually mean it. But that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is that generally they are truthful in terms of how they conduct themselves with you, how they transact with you. Something that does not exist in a country like India. I was not even aware that you should actually speak the truth for the sake of speaking the truth. So those are the things, values a person should be able to imbibe in himself with time. And that takes several decades, several generations, in my view. And that can only happen if a very, very small proportion of your society at any point of time is made up of first or second generation immigrants. My view is no more, it should not be more than 0.1 or 0.05% of your population.
Right. And I think of the process that you describe yourself going through to some extent, or that other people should go through if they're kind of being properly inculcated, you could say that the West is kind of going the other direction, right? They're teaching people how to become, as you say, feral third world people. Is this something in your travels that you see kind of happening all over the West? I mean, sometimes people say, yeah, it's just as bad in other countries, but each country, I noticed this on Twitter, imagines itself to be kind of having this isolated problem with woke of its own sort. But when you start comparing the notes of everybody, it seems like there's a lot of this going on. And it's sort of like heading that way quickly and irreversibly, if anything. I mean, what is your impression?
Oh, I completely agree with that. I think the whole of the West has taken a wrong path. The wokeness is a result of democracy. It's a result of the masses taking decisions which are emotionally good, but rationally stupid. And masses don't want to think. Masses just want to worry about their 9 to 5 jobs, their evening beers and good dinners and vacations. And they want to take quick emotional decisions which sound good rather than which are good and rational. And they are the people who decide on who becomes your rulers. And hence you have people like Trudeau, who says that there are 50% women in his cabinet because this is 2020 or whatever it is. And you have people like Biden who selects one of the top judges of the country based on her sex and skin color rather than her merit. So the wokeness has to be the end product of democracy anyway. And this degeneration of the institutions in the West is happening across the board because the West have been too open-minded, too democratic for far too long now. So I can't think of any Western countries that has not chosen to degrade itself. The only package of countries that I said copied the Western societies successfully are the societies that actually are not degrading themselves, and that is East Asia. You can't settle down you can't become a citizen of Japan easily, and same is the case with Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and China. And South Korea. And I think they are doing the right thing. And that is why I think the future of humanity is in these East Asian countries. Now, all these East Asian countries have copied the Western values. Now, they have not been able to copy all the Western values. They are not Christian, for example. And I think Christianity is the foundational principle. Without Christianity, all these values will fall away eventually. But East Asia, certainly for now, has been able to copy the Western values, incorporate them in their societies, and have done an absolutely fabulous job of keeping their societies on the right path.
That's interesting. So I guess you're not maybe Hindu anymore if you've moved. Are you Christian, or are you just saying that kind of culturally you see certain values in there that have to undergird all this?
I am. My family is a Jain family, and Jains are a minority religion in India. But you could pretty much call me a Hindu as my religious background. But having said that, I became an atheist when I was in my teens. It's only for the last 5 or 10 years that I have started to realize that all these Western values could not have emerged without the interaction between Greco-Roman philosophy and Christianity. And the concept of honor that Germanic tribes already had. So the interaction of all these things created what is European civilization, and Christianity has been a very important pillar of it, which I have come to see very clearly. You remove Christianity and what you have is another kind of religion, which is this wokeness as the religion. I mean, this wokeness is a religion, Messenger. State is a religion. So you remove Christianity and the moral values go away. The moral fabric that is laid on the society goes away. Now, individuals can stay moral, but they are not connected to the society anymore. And that is why we don't really have, increasingly we are fragmented people. And while I continue to be an atheist, I have, as time has gone by, taken more and more interest in Christianity. In fact, just before I came on this call, I was listening to a Christian preacher, Bishop Sobone, I think, a fabulous speaker. He talks a lot of sense to me. So I listen to a lot of Christian talks these days.
Yeah, and that's part of the reason why I've listened to some of your interviews. It's very interesting is you come from such a different background, and even not being a Christian, you just openly identify the positives, and you don't have any sense of like, well, I need to say this and say that to make people feel better. It's just you just bluntly state the facts, so which is very helpful for us, right? I mean, a lot of people in the West have kind of, frankly, become accustomed to being abused in their own countries by their own leaders and stuff. So when you hear that these things are positive, which is what we heard when we were very young, it kind of reminds us that, oh, okay, well, maybe these things aren't really broken. They were working fine. Like you say, we just have this new religion, which is kind of destructive in itself. I mean, it's not, they keep saying they were going to help everybody, but instead their main goal seems to be to attack and tear all these things down. It's interesting. Were you going to say something? I'm sorry.
Yeah, well, I mean, remember that, think about the brutality that used to exist in Japan. Think about the brutalities that higher caste Brahmins of Indians used to impose on the lower caste people or on women. To the extent that these people are civilized, and now we can claim that these are spiritual people. The spirituality of Hinduism comes from these specific kind of people, or the greatness of Japan comes from a certain kind of Japanese. The reality is that these are people who have become good to the extent that they have been Christianized. Now, they might not have directly become Christian, but directly or indirectly they learned the Christian values, and that could have happened because the English were ruling these countries, or other Europeans were ruling these countries, or because the initial educational system was set in place by Christian missionaries who did a fabulous job in these countries. So directly or indirectly, they are civilized to the extent that they were colonized by Europeans, and to the extent that Christianity was spread either directly or indirectly in these societies.
Right. So I can get a sense of where you think it's going, because the West is sort of heading backwards into this, third worldism. And I know you've commented before that people get a little bit obsessed with trying to say left, right, communism, whatever. But your point is sort of, look, there's these core values of Western civilization. You referred to kind of the Greco-Roman origins, the influence of Christianity, a little bit of kind of Germanic tribal honor, and that without these things, you're not necessarily heading towards any specific thing like left, right, or communism. You're heading towards this sort of third world federalism. So if we're seeing this kind of political collapse, I guess to switch gears to another angle on this, How does this play out, do you think, in terms of economies? And, for individual people, how do they try to protect themselves from these things? I mean, if you can't culturally protect yourself, at least financially, you should sort of think of ways of how it's going to go to hell, and how to kind of not have bad habits that where you get washed away with all these things.
Uh, Protecting yourself financially is very easy today because of the internet and because of the ease of travel that we have. I like to think that as it stands today, East Asia is the most stable part of the world and has the longest duration in front of it, that it will stay relatively sane. So I like to keep my money in East Asia. I like to invest in East Asia. Now, it does not have to give me very good returns, but the very fact that I can keep my money there is itself an insurance for me. And you have to keep your money outside the jurisdiction that you live in. You don't want what just happened in Canada. Justin Trudeau decided that he could pretty much freeze accounts of anyone without having to use the process of judiciary. In fact, he didn't have to do it himself. The local branch manager could decide on freezing your account. And you don't want to face that, in which you don't have the money to go to the court to sue the government or get your account unfrozen. So have bank accounts outside the jurisdiction you live in, and be able, put yourself in a position that you can move around if you have to. I believe in the concept of community. I think I should have become a part of a community where I lived among people, physically lived among people I loved, whose values I belonged to. But of course, I did not grow up in such a society. I grew up in an amoral hellhole. So I did not have that feeling of community. And when I moved to urban areas in the Western society, they are, again, fragmented people. They are not really a community by themselves. So but I always, Messenger, think about possibly moving to a rural place at some point of time.
Right. So it's still more traditional. So when people then say, hey, I mean, it's kind of popular now to say, oh, it's all falling apart and look at Trudeau taking their money away. Well, you should do Bitcoin or something. And you've got some older people who say buy gold. You're saying, well, look, if these East Asian societies are more stable and things are really going to go to hell, maybe you need an account with some Singapore dollars and some Japanese dollars or something like that is even better, because I suppose people can still take your Bitcoin away.
Yes, absolutely. Have different currencies. Have Japanese yen, Korean won, Hong Kong dollars, Singaporean dollars. Have bank accounts in those countries outside the control of your government, and have those currencies for diversification purposes. If you're going to have money in US dollar anyway, if you're just going to keep bank deposit, why not have bank deposits in different currencies, which actually help you in case there is too much inflation in US dollar, for example. So diversify your currencies, invest in those countries, and maybe go and visit them once in a while. Maybe you can go and travel around. Maybe you can buy a house and live there. Now, they are not going to like that you come and try to live there. But I want to move. I want to live in a country where they don't want me to move there, because I don't want it to be easy for people to move into those societies.
Right. Everybody will just, when there's a problem, massive problems, and everybody else would just follow you in there, I guess that's the point.
Well, I mean, remember, currently people think that you leave a society because there are tyrants ruling that society. No, the tyrants of my country, the country that I grew up in, are brain dead. They are junkies. They have no real power to trouble me. The real problem I had was with Indians. Now, when I moved to Canada, Messenger, do I want Indians to follow me? No, the answer is no. Now, of course, it's very hypocritical that I want to move to Canada, but I don't want other Indians to move to Canada. But that's the dilemma that whole this immigration situation exists in.
Right, because in a way, what you're describing is that orderly cultures are really like a rare resource. And of course, if you don't start with one, that's what you're looking for. And if you are in one, if you manage to get yourself in one, the last thing you want to do is destroy it. So we all kind of end up in that same boat one way or another.
Well, orderly cultures, civilization exist only in the Western society and the people who have copied the Western society, which is East Asia. So orderly cultures, civilizations do not erupt from nowhere. It was a process of, I would say, 5,000, 10,000 years, and particularly a process that took the West 2,000 years, the recent 2,000 years. It might look simple to people who have grown up in an orderly society, who have grown up in a civilization, but people who come from outside that society should learn to recognize how valuable civilization is, because civilization differentiates human beings from animals.
Right. I guess, so as the last question I'd like to ask is sort of, I guess it depends on the person, right? If someone's unrealistic and they're woke or something, I might want to wake them up. So I probably would tell them to travel to some of these other countries that they fantasize are so wonderful and see the ugly reality. On the other hand, for people who maybe have already kind of woken up a little bit, then there are things that they can read or travel they can do to get a little bit smarter. And I think, one of the things that I like as a source is I've looked through your Capitalism and Morality conference, which you have every year. I mean, I think it was put off by the pandemic, but it looks like you're scheduled for July this year. If it goes through, that's like in Vancouver, Canada. And you have some great speakers. These are people that I'd heard of before. Like Rick Rule, I think Lou Rockwell's another fellow, that other folks that I know that are sharp folks have told me about before. So are there any sort of references that you kind of have that are your favorites in terms of people wanting to become more informed? Or do we just show up at your conference and then we kind of start from there?
Well, so the reason I started this conference was to convey to Western people how important Western civilization is, how important Western values are, and how important it is these values are to keep us human. If we give up on those values, if we give up on those objective values, we are going to turn feral and animalistic, and we will operate from our animalistic desires, which is what people of the third world do. So that is the basis behind that conference. I hope Justin Trudeau allows me to run my seminar this summer. Right now, Justin Trudeau has become a full-blown tyrant. He wants to restrict movement of people. He wants to restrict so many things that I haven't been able to go back to Canada for 2 years now, just because of the quarantine requirements that he has imposed. The U.S. has been a great place. I'm currently in the U.S. It's a lovely place. It has been very hospitable. And clearly, it shows why the U.S. is still the best country on the planet. But those are the kind of values I want people to be more conscious of, rather than take those values as granted.
Great. Okay. I think what we'll do now is if we'll wrap up, but let's see if there's anybody who would like to ask a question. We'll raise your hand now. We'll bring you up or request to speak, and then you can ask Jay a question, and otherwise we'll wrap up. We'll just give people a few seconds here. All right. I don't see any hands, so I think we're all going to wrap. Thanks for your hour. Oh, I've got a request. I've got 2 requests. Okay, I guess it was just taking some time. All right, let me just bring up these fellows. Hang on just a second. One at a time. Okay, Rajiv is connecting. Go ahead, Rajiv.
Hey, Jayant. I'd never heard of you before, but it's great to hear you speak. And so as someone who's a second-generation immigrant in America, I broadly agree with almost everything you're saying, and I too get frustrated when people sort of romanticize India or the third world when they've never actually been there and seen how chaotic and tribalistic it is. I was interested to hear. It was interesting to see how you framed, the only other people who've been relatively, equivalent successful in implementing an orderly society are East Asians who've copied Christian or Western values, and I think there's a lot of truth to it. One thing I guess I have a question for you, if you've thought about it, is I know at least in the West there's a huge fertility crisis where, people aren't having enough children, especially I live in a rural sort of white community, and it's kind of dying because a lot of people are moving out or people aren't having children. And I also see that as a problem in China, especially as the population gets older and they're kind of recoiling or having the consequences from having a one-child policy too long. I know Xi Jinping has extended it to 3 children now, but it seems like, you were saying, China or East Asia is kind of the future in terms of progress and technology and civilization, but I kind of see that they're also going to hit this fertility crisis or this fertility wall where they're not going to have enough children to take care of the elderly population or continue sort of progress and growth. So I'm hoping to hear you speak on how you think, if they are in fact, the beacon of civilization moving forward, as you claim, how are they going to deal with the fact that they're kind of slowly dying out? I mean, I think it's especially true in Japan, where, as you said, they don't have immigration, and just there's a lot of people who aren't getting married and having children, and that's going to be a big problem for maintaining the society.
So Rajiv, thanks very much. I really love hearing those kind of words from someone who comes from India. Now, as far as what's happening in Japan and China is concerned, that's exactly what's been happening with native people of European ethnicity. The only reason Europeans don't have as much of a population, seemingly as much of a population crisis as Japan has, is because they have been bringing in a lot of people from outside the Western world. Now, there is no evidence that the refugees, the recent immigrants have been able to add value to the Western world. All these refugees have been a huge, huge cost to Europe and the US. So believing that trying to maintain your population by giving out free stuff to refugees and immigrants is going to stabilize your society is completely erroneous. So as such, I don't necessarily see Japan and China doing anything worse than what Western societies have been doing if letting people in was for maintaining your population. Japan is doing perfectly fine from what I see. They are becoming very high tech in terms of doing the certain kind of jobs that a lower population requires. So they have done a good job with that. But I completely agree with you on one thing, that why should population be falling? I think maybe people have to learn to have more children, but that's a problem across the world, not just in Japan. And it's actually a problem that's going to become worse for all the educated people around the world. So we have a problem there. I don't have a solution to that.
Yeah, thanks. I wasn't suggesting. Of course, I'm 100% with you. I don't believe the solution to Western fertility crisis is to import immigrants. I mean, it's a very stupid idea, but it's still a problem regardless. And so I don't think anybody has a solution right now, from what I can tell, on how to get, whether it's Western Europe or America or Canada or Japan or China, how to get people who are educated and well off to have more children. And that's just gonna be a problem moving forward.
Yeah, I think East Asia has probably the best solution to that, because, if Western societies, assuming other problems don't exist, if Western societies are constantly dependent on immigrants coming in to support the older population and to make up for the loss of the local people not having children, they have to keep importing people forever. Now, that mathematically is impossible. So you have to take corrective action now rather than 50 years from now. So if Japan and China are already not accepting immigrants, they're creating a social and organizational structure where they can live with a lower population. Whereas Western people can no longer live with that. If they suddenly shut their doors shut, what they will face is a sudden increase in older people compared to the working population, and that will create a massive crisis with pension and social security. So better do what Japan is doing rather than what the US or Germany is doing, for example.
Great. All right, Raj, you got your answer there. I'm going to move up Advi if you're all done.
Yep, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, Advi, are you connected? If so, go ahead.
So, I'm also Indian like Rajiv, and you are as well. But, I had some issues with what you said about East Asia. Like, Japan was already a pretty rich country, right? Like, they were one of the premier powers of the world before, they got completely wiped out in World War II. So I don't really think they're aping the West. I mean, there is some history of them aping the West when you look at how they kind of copied the European royalty and whatnot, but they still weren't democratic. Like, in the sense that they were democratic, no, they didn't get rich as a democracy, right? They rebuilt as a democracy. And it wasn't really hard to rebuild because all the infrastructure was still there, and you had the U.S. military kind of holding their hands throughout the whole process. And South Korea was actually a dictatorship up till 1980. So, like, after that, I'm sure you can say, they did it themselves in a semi-democratic fashion. But even then, there is kind of a strain of authoritarianism within the South Korean government. Like, I don't know if you know about this. I mean, you probably do. I actually, before the pandemic, I used to read your articles like every day on the bus to college when they were on LouRockwell.com. I'd watch Ron Paul Liberty Report as well. But it seems like but there was a story with the South Korean lady, like she was influence peddling. Like, there was this whole kind of oligarchy in the back, which was telling her, hey, do this, do that. So I don't think they're a good example of aping the West, right? I'd say with democracy, I totally agree with you. I think democracy is a very flawed system. As for India, like I said this on an older space, I think they have to get rid of the reservation system, which I think is absolutely disgraceful. I think if India needs to get forward, it needs to be as a meritocracy. And I'm from the fire caste, as I think Rajiv is too. So I probably wouldn't want to see many Muslims or Sikhs do well, but if they do it, I mean, that's life, right? They have to, and I think they have to remove regulations, and they have to solve, like you mentioned, that the Brahmins oppressed women. I think oppression of women isn't that big of a deal. Like, everybody does that, but you look at the other half, which was oppression of the lower caste. Really, the only people that were the scheduled caste, not even the scheduled tribes. Like, scheduled tribes weren't even counted as Hindu by the British. That was Nehru, who in the 1951 census added them in. I think for scheduled caste, you have to recognize that they're their own independent religion. They're the descendants of those that were excommunicated from Hinduism, right? Like, they have all those stories of, like, one caste falling out of favor and then kicking out. Like, there's even scheduled castes in India who have R1A haplogroup, which means they're descended from the same Indo-Aryans that we are. So, like, some of them are Aryan as well. Like, and once more, I have.
You try to wrap up, Advi. Thanks. Some of the stuff on R1A, I don't know if people know that. So I do know that Japan, of course, you're talking about before the war, but remember there was the Meiji period in the 1800s where they were also opening up to Western culture and adopting.
Yeah, but they were already pretty rich. They were already one of the premier powers of the world even then. Like, they were going toe-to-toe with Russia, and, like, remember, America wanted to come in, like, for a reason, because Japan was a very rich country already. Right, they weren't really.
Yeah, but the Meiji period starts like in the 1860s, right? It's long before World War II, even World War I.
Even like then, they weren't exactly a poor country. They were still somewhat comparable to the West. Right?
Well, So what I'm saying is that they actively gave respect to Western values during Meiji Restoration. They actually sent their elite to understand the German and European ways of organizations and technology, and they, with gratitude, imported that to Japan. Now, Advi, being an Indian, you probably understand this thing that most immigrants have no concept of gratitude. When they face compassion and tolerance in the West, their response usually is within among themselves is, hey, these Western people are so stupid. They trust us so much. So Japanese, I completely agree. They were structured already to imbibe within their culture the Western values. And other people are not even structured culturally to accept the Western values because they don't have that operating system. So I completely agree with you to that extent. I might object to one thing in which you said that they haven't imported the democratic values. Now, democratic values are not a part of Western values. Democratic values are the recent phenomenon which emerged from the age of enlightenment and are closer to wokeness than to Western values, in my view. Nothing wrong with authoritarianism.
So you refer to Western values as being like honest and decent people? Like, I would agree with that.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And so see, I have been doing business for the last 30 years in the Western society. Most of my contracts are verbal contracts on the phone, and I've hardly had any problems with anyone. With Indians, we go around designing a contract for months, trying to perfect that contract. And a day after we sign that contract, the other person refuses to honor that contract. And then we go through that cycle again, and it goes forever. Here is the problem. We don't have the spirit of honesty. We don't have the spirit of truthfulness in the third world. The culture of honor was already in Japan, and I completely agree with you, even before the Meiji restoration happened, because they would not have started the process had they not the fundamental ingredients to absorb the European values. But as far as authoritarianism is concerned, East Asia is still authoritarian, and I'm so happy it is. I don't want it to become democratic, because the day it becomes democratic, it will become emotional. It will become increasingly woke. It will take emotional decisions, which is what the West is doing today, and it will degrade very rapidly. So I'm very happy it's authoritarian, not democratic.
Also, like, what was the other thing? Like, you said that, Trudeau, like, his whole thing, I don't think his rise is really related to immigration or anything like that. Like, if you read about the Fabian, like, whatever model of governance from the UK and whatever, that's where his whole thing comes from, right? Like, once more, it's an enlightenment kind of value. I wouldn't really pin that on, like,
absolutely. I again agree. It's a result of, even if the Western society had not brought in immigrants, this degradation had to happen because of the democratic system. Democratic system is dictatorship of the masses, which means that it's meritocracy completely inverted. The masses who are least competent to decide who the ruler should be decide on who the ruler is. So democratic system has to lead to a vicious cycle in which with every change of government, the character of the government has to increasingly reflect the character of the masses. And that's what's been happening in the West.
All right. Did we cover all of your questions there, Advi?
Yeah, basically I found this to be a very enlightening space for the...
Good. Me too, actually. And I have listened to Jayant before, but I learned some new things today. So I really appreciate you joining us, Jayant. This was very instructive. And I did put a link before when I invited everybody through tweets to come to the interview. So what I'll do after this is I'll again put up the Capitalism and Morality link for 2022. And also just find maybe I think you probably have links to some of your sort of podcast interviews on your site as well. So I'll put those because you talk about a range of topics and, there are other things that people can dig into and learn about, things like economy, and you have some more focus interviews. So I'll get those things all up once we finish here. And I just want to thank you once more for joining us. And it was quite entertaining. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much for the opportunity, Messenger.